200 years ago, a language died. There was no speaker left of it. But in the recent decades, this language has been brought back to life. This is the story of Cornish, a Celtic language spoken in England. Forgotten for some time, brought back to life, this language is still critically endangered, but people are fighting for it.
Gorthira Elizabeth of V, ha Trigis of in Kerno, ha Kernoas of, me goes and yeth Kernoic Kernoagoras of.
Cornish, also called Kernoic, is a language spoken in England, and more precisely in the southwest county of Cornwall. Today, there are about slightly more than 500 speakers of the language, but about 200 years ago, there was no one left who could speak this language. Cornish is a Celtic language, and more specifically, a southwestern Brittonic language, a branch of the Insular Celtic section of the Celtic language family. The other language from this family is Breton, spoken in France, which is also in a situation of endangerment, although less than Cornish, and it has more speakers with a number above 100,000. The Welsh language is also a cousin of Cornish, as it is a Brittonic language, but from the Western Brittonic branch. Celtic languages used to be more common and widespread in Western Europe, up until the Roman invasion. After that, they have been drastically declining over the centuries. Many of them disappeared. Today, the areas where Celtic languages are spoken are relatively small, and they are all in a situation of endangerment, some more than others. Back in 1300, the area where Cornish was spoken was bigger than where it is spoken today, but it slowly regressed over the centuries to become smaller and smaller. As the area where Cornish was spoken shrunk, the number of speakers also declined progressively. The number of people living in Cornwall steadily increased from the year 1000 to now, and the number of speakers first also increased. But starting towards 1300, where there was approximately 40,000 speakers out of 50,000 people living in the area, the number slowly declined. In 1750, the number of Cornish speakers was close to zero, and it reached zero in 1800, while the population in the area reached almost 200,000. It's around 1800 that Cornish is said to have disappeared, albeit before that. Dolly Penrith, who died in 1777, is said to be the last native speaker of Cornish. Today, there are about 500 fluent speakers and around 3,000 people who know some Cornish to an extent. How does a language that supposedly died comes back to life centuries later? Cornish is not the only language in this situation, and there's actually many different cases of languages that are said to have died and were brought back to life decades, centuries, or even millennia later. This kind of situation is why many linguists prefer the term dormant to describe language with no speakers left, as there can be cases where speakers reappear later on. For the case of Cornish, revival efforts are often traced to have begun in 1904, almost 130 years after the last speaker died. During this year, Henry Jenner, a Celtic language scholar and Cornish cultural activist, published a book called A Handbook of the Cornish Language. This publication is often considered to be the point at which the revival movement started. 1 year later, he wrote the following about the Cornish language. One may fairly say that most of what there was of it has been preserved, and that it has been continuously preserved, for there has never been a time where there were not some Cornishmen who knew some Cornish. This quote shows two main points regarding the revival of the language and the cultural aspect of the language. First, even though there was no speaker left, there was still some remnant of the language that survived, which can be key in the context of language revival. This takes the form of some words that still got passed down from generation to generation, but also literature and texts in Cornish that were established in the centuries before. If you're wondering how Cornish got revived without any speakers around, here's what happened. The phonology of the language, meaning the sounds found in it, is based on various sources, which includes reconstruction of the sound system based on historical texts, orthographies, and rhymes used in various texts. Add to that a comparison with other Brittonic languages, like Breton and Welsh, and you can recreate the sounds used. Something quite helpful was the work of the linguist Edward Llewellyn, who visited Cornwall in 1700 and recorded the language in a partly phonetic orthography. A lot of words and translated texts are helpful to understand how the grammar works as well as using words again. Of course, reviving a language is not easy and can require the use of neologisms, the action of coining a new word. To do so, the use of a similar language, in this case Breton or Welsh, can be used to create neologisms. Step by step, the language can be reconstructed, learned, and then passed on to others to grow. Cornish today is recognized under the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages, and the language is often described as an important part of Cornish identity, culture, and heritage. Since the language's resurgence, a few Cornish textbooks and literary works have been released, and more people are learning the language. Cornish can also be found on street nameplates, children's novels, independent films, and Cornish music are examples of recent developments. On top of that, the language is taught in schools. This is a major aspect when it comes to language revitalization and language revival, as it ensures that younger generations learn the language and can transmit it later on as well. Besides schools, 2010 saw the opening of the first Cornish language daycare. As such, a few people in Cornwall were raised to be multilingual native speakers. While the current linguistic situation for Cornish looks hopeful, there's a need for me to mention that language revitalization does not always come in without struggles. Besides the obvious difficulties of reviving or revitalizing a language, in the case of Cornish, there was also tensions and disputes regarding a specific aspect of the modern version of the language, its orthography. It started in 1929 with Robert Morton Nance, who published his unified Cornish system, based on Middle Cornish literature. To that, he added several neologisms and forms based on Celtic roots also found in Breton and Welsh. He ultimately published a dictionary in 1938. His work became a basis for the revival of Cornish for most of the 20th century. However, in the 70s, Nance's system faced a lot of criticism regarding inconsistent orthographies and unpredictable correspondences between spelling and pronunciation. In addition, people highlighted the fact that this system was based on an archaic form and was not emphasizing spoken language enough. This led to the creation of various rival systems. In the 1980s, Ken George introduced a new system called Common Cornish, which is founded on a reconstruction of the phonological system of Middle Cornish and employs a mostly morphophonemic orthography. This means that each letter represented a specific sound, making a clear letter-to-sound correspondence. This Common Cornish system was adopted by the Cornish Language Board and became the written form used by more than the majority of language users, about 54.5% of users in 2008. If you're wondering what the Cornish Language Board is, it's an organization that promotes the Cornish language. It was founded in 1967 by the Gorthes Kernel, another organization that also promotes the Cornish language. This organization was founded in 1928 by Henry Jenner, the same person who was at the origin of the Cornish revival movement. Although this Common Cornish was used by a majority of speakers, it was also criticized for various reasons by some other language activists like John Mills and Nicholas Williams. Some of the criticism focused on some phonological distinctions found in Common Cornish that were, according to them, not made in the traditional language from before it went extinct. In addition, they believed that the orthography deviated too much from traditional text or from the unified Cornish that Nance designed. They made their own system, but it never got the popularity of the others. The coexistence of multiple orthographies was recognized as being a problem and being unsustainable when it comes to language teaching and education. The main question of which orthography should be taught became one of the main problems. This could be different from one place to another, and this could impact the revitalization efforts. Because of this potential problem, a process of unification was started in 2005 by the Cornish Language Partnership, another group set up in the same year to promote the language. In 2008, a unified standard written form was accepted and is now used as the standard to write Cornish. The story of Cornish will not be fully complete without talking about some of its unique features. Cornish presents a lot of unusual linguistic features, making it quite different from a lot of other European languages or even Indo-European languages. For example, word order in Cornish is verb, subject, object. About 9% of the world's languages follow this structure. It's not the most uncommon structure, but it's definitely not the most common either. Although this is the default word order, like many other Celtic languages, Cornish has a level of fluidity in its word order, meaning some sentences can be formed with a different word order and still be grammatical. Usually this happens to focus and emphasize certain elements of the sentence. Another rare feature is that Cornish presents a dual system. Well, partially at least. In most languages, you have a distinction between singular, one person, one object, and plural, multiple people, objects. But in some languages, you can find another system, duality. Besides the singular versus plural distinction, you have a dual system for when talking about two people or two objects. A small number of nouns in Cornish display relics of a dual system. They are formed by prefixing masculine du or feminine di, both meaning two, to the respective noun. Dual nouns are often parts of the body and indicate the pair of them taken together. Lagas, eye, to do lagas, pair of eyes. Brech, arm, to divrech, pair of arm. These carry different meaning to the regular plural forms, such as lagaso, eyes, brecho, arms, which do not indicate a matching pair. Cornish nouns, like those of other Celtic languages and many Indo-European languages, possess two grammatical genders. They belong to one or two groups, masculine or feminine. Cornish has no indefinite articles. Both can either mean harbour or a harbour. In certain contexts, un can be used, with the meaning a certain, a particular, un port, a certain harbour. There is, however, a definite article, an, meaning the, which is used for all nouns regardless of their gender or numbers. An port, the harbour. Similar to other Celtic languages, Cornish has an underlying vigesimal counting system. In English, we have a decimal system, where we go by tens, 20, 30, 40, 50. But in a vigesimal system, you will go by 20s. One phonological feature of Cornish is that it distinguishes between short and long consonants. This is called gemination, or consonant lengthening, where a consonant is articulated for a longer period of time than its shorter counterpart. Cornish makes the difference between s and s, and f and f. Actually, gemination in Cornish is found on multiple consonants. Gemination happens in a lot of languages in connected speech, which means how we speak in our daily interactions, but it does not always have a phonological value like it does in Cornish. For example, if I say he speaks several languages, because there's the sound s at the end of speaks and at the beginning of several, in connected speech I don't say speaks several, but instead one long s to connect the two words. To me, this does not have a phonological value, or in other words, that the long s is not changing the meaning of words. But in Cornish, or languages where gemination has a phonological value, a long s sound modifies the meaning of a word. Here's an example of the difference between short and long consonants that change the meaning of a word. Pel is a ball, but pel means distant. Almost every consonant has a double consonant counterpart. Double consonants are pronounced with double length, but in later forms of Cornish, the geminates m and n tend to be pronounced with a b before the sound m and a d sound before n. It's called pre-occlusion, and this may be written bm and dn in the written form of the language. This list of features is clearly not exhaustive, and there are plenty more to discover about Cornish, and if you're interested, I invite you to look into it. There are plenty of websites sharing grammatical aspects of Cornish. It's quite an interesting language, but also an interesting way to learn more on how a language that stopped being spoken got brought back to life, and how its grammar got maintained. Cornish is not the first language to be revived, and it's definitely not the last one either. However, it's an essential example of how important languages are to their people. The Cornish language is an important aspect of the Cornish culture and its people. That's why many individuals are working towards revitalizing it. Today, most Celtic languages are in a situation of language endangerment, and even Cornish is still not completely safe. Seeing the work and efforts of people to maintain it, share it, and transmit it shows that even when a language is in a dire situation, not everything is lost.